Leaving the little office above a mother and child store on Dubai's Crescent Drive, Mohammad Islami clutched a one-page handwritten note listing the price of the apocalypse. A few $100 million. The German engineer Heinz Mebus and Sri Lankan businessmen Muhammad Farooq and Buhari Sayyid Ali Tahir were willing to provide uranium enrichment technology, sample gas centrifuges, and the equipment to manufacture them. There was even a 15-page technical document provided by their boss, Pakistan's nuclear weapons czar, explaining how to mill the uranium spheres at the heart of a nuclear bomb. For over a year now, Iranian and United States diplomats have been engaged in negotiations on how to put that nuclear genie back in the bottle. In principle, the deal couldn't be simpler. America needs Iran's oil and gas to help wean the world off Russian hydrocarbons. Iran needs an end to sanctions that have crippled its economy. Iran, though, won't sign unless sanctions on its elite Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps are lifted. And President Joe Biden's administration doesn't have the political capital to make that concession. Earlier this week, Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Saeed Khatibzadeh said the agreement is, and I quote, in the emergency room. 4 years ago, President Donald Trump's administration unilaterally pulled out of a deal Iran had made in 2015 with the so-called P5+1 group of powers, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations, which are the United States, China, Russia, the United Kingdom, and France, as well as Germany. Iran, in essence, agreed to restrictions on its stockpile of highly enriched uranium, the building block for a nuclear weapon, in return for America lifting sanctions that had been imposed back in 2006. Even though the agreement didn't guarantee Iran would never in the future seek nuclear weapons, it significantly enhanced what is known as breakout time, the period it would take Tehran to build a nuclear weapon after deciding it wanted one. That, most experts agreed, was better than the uncertainties of the no-deal landscape. To critics like President Trump, though, the nuclear agreement had one big hole. You see, Iran wasn't compelled to end its research and development of ballistic missiles, which it needed to deliver the nuclear weapons it now said it wasn't going to make. Within weeks of signing the P5+1 agreement, Iran tested its Imad intermediate-range guided missile that can deliver a 1750 kilogram payload, enough for a nuclear weapon, to targets up to 2,500 kilometers away. Iran, a second argument against the deal runs, could evade the international monitoring provisions of the nuclear deal easily enough. Israel, after all, had done exactly the same thing. First promising that its Dimona nuclear plant would never be used to manufacture nuclear weapons, and then defeating inspections by bricking off key parts of the facility and even providing faked reactor operations data to inspectors. Together with Saudi Arabia, Israel also argued the P5+1 agreement hadn't addressed a third problem: Iran's use of proxies as well as terrorist groups to pursue its geopolitical interests in the region. Lifting sanctions, they asserted, would give Tehran the economic muscle it needed to push its regional war aggressively. To the anger of his P5+1 partners, and of course the anger of Iran, President Donald Trump's administration listened to the critics and unilaterally withdrew from the agreement in 2018. Even though President Trump's sanctions on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps are of little substance, especially since separate ones will anyway remain in place even if the nuclear deal goes through, the political equities for both sides are large. President Biden would expose himself to domestic critics from powerful politicians and lobbies sympathetic to Israel should he lift the IRGC sanctions. Iranian hawks, similarly, won't allow a deal that keeps the sanctions in place. The problem, you see, really boils down to trust. The relationship between the United States and Iran fractured back in 1979 when revolutionary Islamists took American diplomats hostage at the United States Embassy in Tehran. The United States also saw the revolution as a fundamental threat to the post-Second World War order it was building in the Persian Gulf, centered around protecting access to the region's oil. The United States backed Iraq's war against Iran from 1980. Iran, in turn, struck at United States targets in the region through proxies like Hezbollah, once bombing a United States Marines barracks in Beirut in 1983. Following 9/11, some signs of pragmatism emerged from Tehran, as I noted before. Iran provided intelligence on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda to the United States, and in 2003 conveyed conditions for peace talks through Swiss diplomats. The Bush administration, full of hubris after the quick overthrow of the Taliban and Saddam Hussein, didn't respond, expert Barbara Slavin has recorded. Instead, Washington gambled on its coercive options, believing it could overthrow the Ayatollahs. In 2002, then-President George W. Bush had branded Iran part of a, I quote, axis of evil that had to be overthrown. Tehran concluded that, like Saddam Hussein's Iraq, it would also be targeted for regime change. To protect itself, Iran backed Shia insurgents in Iraq, who staged hundreds of attacks on American troops, tying them down in an unwinnable urban war. In addition, Iran allowed Al-Qaeda jihadists to transit through its territory from Iraq to Syria, and it began supplying weapons to the Taliban in Afghanistan. In the so-called Arab Spring of the 2010s, Iran expanded its regional influence. It backed President Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria and undermined Saudi Arabia's efforts to take control of Yemen. Hezbollah, Iran's Lebanon-based client group, also received enhanced support. The P5+1 nuclear agreement could, in addition to tamping down Iran's nuclear ambitions, have addressed the mistrust between the region powers. Instead, it was blown apart by them. Few think the breakdown of the P5+1 agreement has made the region more secure. For one, Iran's breakout time has diminished. In response to Trump's decision to walk out of the agreement, Iran began enriching uranium to 60% purity, far higher than the grade needed for generating power for research or other such activities. Israeli experts claim Iran is now just 24 months away from being able to field an entire nuclear weapons arsenal, a plausible contention. The larger problem is, the deal isn't just about nuclear weapons. Tehran and Washington need to agree on the role and influence Iran ought to have in the region, and then get states like Israel and Saudi Arabia to sign on to this order. Lessons learned by both sides could provide a bedrock for the agreement. Iran, as I said, desperately needs access to Western markets if its moribund economy is to revive. In spite of its close relationship with China, Tehran has learned the partnership isn't a substitute for genuine reintegration in the global economy. According to the China Global Investment Tracker, China invested less than $30 billion in Iran from 2010 to 2020. In the same period, China invested more than $43 billion in Saudi Arabia and $36 billion in the United Arab Emirates. Iran might have been forced to look east, expert William Figuera has noted, but China is looking in many directions. Iran isn't the only country it's worried about. For its part, Washington has also learned that coercion has its limits. Long-running sanctions debilitated North Korea, but did not tip over its regime or impede its nuclear weapons and missile programs. Iran's theocratic regime, likewise, remains intact in spite of years of sanctions. The United States' policies haven't made the Persian Gulf more secure, nor ensured Iran will never be able to get a nuclear weapon. The two sides have, over decades, rarely missed a chance to miss a chance. The world will face a hefty bill should they fail yet again. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm National Security Editor of ThePrint.